Good afternoon and welcome to the launch of the Afrobarometer survey. My name is Ashwin Berry. Now let's get into the business of the day. Afrobarometer is a pan-African non-partisan survey research. And today we'll be looking at statistics and discussing with our panelists three subjects, mainly COVID-19 vaccine hesitation, lived poverty, and gender-based violence. Now, we'll be talking also to Mr. Christy Kulder, who is the Managing Director for Survey Warehouse, about these findings. Christy, welcome. I feel a little awkward welcoming you to your statistics, but it's good to have you here. It really is. Now, Christy, tell us about Afrobarometer and what is the role of Survey Warehouse?
Yes, Survey Warehouse is the national partner for the Afrobarometer network. The Afrobarometer network is currently registered as an NGO in Accra, Ghana, with offices in Kenya and in South Africa. And we execute this opinion poll on a regular basis and has done so since 1999. So as the national partner, we conduct the survey every year.
All right. And so you conduct the survey on behalf of Afrobarometer?
Yes.
All right. And I know we're going to get into it. What has been your general overview of the experience?
Well, I think one of the advantages of being able to do this for such a long period of time is that we collect time series data. And I think, when we share some of the findings today, we'll see just how powerful that kind of analysis can be.
And you get this data from ordinary Namibians?
Yes, 1,200 ordinary Namibians above the age of 18 are being interviewed.
All right. Well, I'm excited for our findings. Of course, what we get into may not necessarily warrant much excitement, but we are, of course, going to be delivering the facts. After the break, we'll be welcoming our very first panelist from the Ministry of Health and Social Services, and we'll be talking about COVID-19 vaccine hesitancy. See you soon. Thank you for joining us as we have a look at the Afrobarometer survey. Now, joining us right now in studio is Ms. Emma Iyambo from the Ministry of Health and Social Services. Ms. Iyambo, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, sir.
All right.
And I'm glad to be here.
It's good to have you. Could you tell us briefly what your particular role is at the ministry?
I'm responsible for reproductive and child health, and that's a program or a division or subdivision where immunization program and vaccination program, to be specific, are being led from.
All right.
So in short, I do family health.
All right. Okay, so we're going to be getting straight into vaccination. Christy, could you take us through the first slide?
Yes, the first question, I think, is an important one, and that is to look at the extent to which Namibians are prepared to get vaccinated. 29% of Namibians said they're very unlikely to get vaccinated, which we regard as an anti-vaccination group. 27% of our survey sample has been vaccinated, and another 12% feel that it's very likely that they'll get vaccinated. And those two groups together constitute what we call the pro-vaccination group. And then there's a group in the middle, which is about 29%, or 3 in every 10 Namibians, which are unsure whether they want to get vaccinated or not. And that's the group that we call the movable middle. And that's the group that we also feel should be the target of vaccination campaigns in order to move them from being the movable middle, that middle category, into the vaccination group.
All right. Now, Ms. Yambo, how do these findings correlate with what you've been observing at the Ministry of Health?
Actually, we are actually very excited to that we're having this survey on board, because it will help the ministry a lot. But looking at the figures, what he just narrated now, it speaks to the vaccine hesitancy that Namibia is challenged with. Not only Namibia as in the Ministry of Health, but also other countries in Africa and beyond are faced with a similar challenge. And this also speaks to our vaccination coverage rate since March, which also may link to this number that just got shared now.
All right. Christy, shall we get into the next slide?
Yes. So the next question was on why people are so hesitant to get vaccinated. And there are as many reasons almost as there are Namibians. So what we've done is we've recoded them into sort of larger categories. And in this case, you can see that more than half the population feel or cite a reason having to do with either a trust issue or a safety concern. And these could be trust. There's a particular question that asks whether they trust government to make sure that vaccines are safe. They also ask, there's also a response whether they trust the manufacturers of vaccines, whether they trust the vaccines themselves. So those issues we've all put together. And we can see that the safety concern is perhaps what drives it. The conspiracy theories, which a lot of people have cited as possible reasons, not so popular.
Not so popular. Mr. Yambo, is there any way of mitigating this? Is there any way of getting people to feel less hesitant to take vaccines?
Yes, there are various strategies that can get used in addressing vaccine hesitancy. And that is also among the strategy that the ministry has deployed. That involves also mobilization. I think we've been lucky to witness the mobilization that was spearheaded by our leaders, our ministers, and so forth, including also our governors. So it's a involvement of leaders and community engaging and having a conversation like exactly what we are having here, and to talk about the number and the safety of vaccines, and also to share the numbers out there. I think that all also can influence our vaccination coverage, which stands at 20.8% at this stage.
20.8%. You know, there's a Latin saying, tot facienda parum factum, so little done, so much to do. Christy, what do you think needs to be done?
Well, I can tell you from just looking at the data, there are specific groups which seem to have higher levels of vaccine hesitancy, the youth being one of them. Accidentally, women more than men. There's no real difference between urban and rural areas. And quite interesting, we sort of thought that people's personal experience with the pandemic, so whether they've lost a job or being diagnosed with COVID or having to go to hospital or having lost a loved one because of COVID, would prompt more people to get vaccinated. And it works up to a certain point. Once somebody's had 3 or more experiences with COVID, then we see that the inclination to get vaccinated goes up. But even if people who have had one of those 4 issues are not necessarily more inclined to get vaccinated. So I think campaigns targeted for specific groups is what is called for, and then specifically addressing these concerns about safety and trust.
All right, safety and trust, because yeah, as you highlighted, there are a lot of trust issues to go around. Could you please take us into the next slide?
Yes. Next, we wanted to know whether Namibians would support mandatory vaccinations. And as you're well aware, that there's been a lot of discussions now on whether companies, for example, should make vaccines mandatory. And you can see there that 72% of Namibians said, no, please, we expect, or we prefer vaccines to be an expression of free choice. So only 26% would say that they support mandatory vaccinations. And that, I think, is perhaps a bit of a blow to people who thought that mandatory vaccinations could be a way out. This is not to say that it's not on the cards,
yes.
But it won't have a lot of public support, we feel.
Now, Ms. Yamba, I know the Ministry of Health does not function on opinions. You have some tough decisions to make. Is vaccine mandates one of those decisions?
We live in Namibia is amongst the countries that are democratic, and the health service provision has always been guided by the legal instrument of the country. So it's we live by the principle of being client-oriented. The service provision, including vaccination, like any other service, is based on that principle. So it's a debate that we can throw back to the community and we take it from there. But for now, as per our legal instrument, including the Public Health Environmental Act, vaccination at this stage remain voluntary, and it's a family health decision.
All right. Now, I'm sure statistically this may be true, and I did say you don't function on opinions, but I would like your opinion. If there is a vaccine mandate, what are the chances of us improving from 20%?
Of course, there are many factors that influence vaccination coverage rate, and having vaccination that is based on voluntary is one of them. That can also impact the number, but should it go mandatory, which is up to the community to decide, not necessarily Ministry of Health alone, because we go also driven by the scientific evidence to make decision, and also by the cabinet, which has been also instrumental. But our health service provision remain people-centered, and we listen to that and see what can be done.
All right. Now, Christy, you mentioned that the youth are the most hesitant. I don't think they would like a mandate. That's just an opinion. But what do you think would the response would be? Because I would like to think that the youth are naturally inclined to rebel, especially if they're the most hesitant. If there was a mandate right now, do you think it would be possible to carry it through, or there would be loud noise about it?
No, it's not just that there will be noise about it. I think some people may even consider taking action. Just one thing on this, the anti-mandatory opinion runs rather deep. We also found that over 60% of Namibians would not support the extension of vaccines to their children. And we know that we've extended vaccines to children older than 12 years old. So it's not just that people themselves don't want to get vaccinated, adult Namibians, but it's also that they don't want to vaccinate their children against COVID.
All right. Well, interesting. Do you have another slide for us, Christy?
Yes, last one. So we wanted to know that, and as I said, we've had these discussions about possible groups because of the nature of their work, whether they should have mandatory vaccinations. So we have health workers, for example, 53% of people said they would support mandatory vaccinations for health workers. Only 40% said they would support companies making vaccines mandatory for their staff. 43% would like to see teachers and educational staff, and then only 36% of people said that they will not, or that they won't support, or that they will support events, large events, festivals, and so on, being limited only to vaccinated people.
Being limited only to facts. What is your opinion on that? Look, I know it's difficult to get these statistics and get people's opinions, and really you're just telling us where people's minds are at right now. But in your personal opinion, what would you suggest? What would you suggest to the ministry?
Well, I think, you know, the issue of mandatory vaccinations is very tricky. And we see that there's not a lot of public support for it. So I think, in a way, it would constitute a political risk should governments decide to make vaccines mandatory. On the other hand, we've seen neighboring Botswana now being very tough on people coming in from the outside. And I think generally there's not been a huge reaction to that kind of policy. So maybe, you know, I feel people might say that they don't support it, but once it's in place, it may not lead to much, you know. Okay. Especially if we consider that movable middle that we need to shift. If we can manage to shift those, then I think, you know, there would be less of a need for mandatory vaccinations.
Ms. Yambo, how do you feel people have perceived facts about COVID-19? Because we have been getting facts from science, right? And those facts have been pointing to us needing to get vaccinated. You mentioned Botswana. They are over 40%, doing much better than us right now. What has been the perception to the facts that the ministry has put out? Of course, you have been, I would assume, asking people to stick with science. What has been the general response, and what do you feel we can do as the Namibian community in order to just get more vaccinations going?
As indicated earlier that getting vaccinated is one of a family health matter, we would encourage the community, be it in the form of our gatekeepers, it can be headmen, our queens, our kings, to get into conversation with our own people and get a conversation around the benefit of getting vaccinated. But what the ministry has been doing as of since the COVID-19 or since vaccination got here is to get to share the fact how vaccines work, how do they benefit the person, and what are the disadvantage of not getting vaccinated. And I think that today's video that got launched just an hour ago or so, I really encourage every person, young and old, to get to look out on this video, because there's so much details.
It's on your website, I assume.
It will be surely be there. Our communication officers are hands on that every day.
Yes,
so
indeed.
it's already out there, and it will share also still a lot about. And as science revolves, because COVID-19 changes a lot, the ministry keep also updating the public about the latest information.
All right. From what I'm getting here, you know, there's a saying, they say you can't change someone's mind before you change their mood. Are we essentially saying we need to change how people feel about vaccines?
I think one of the...
Sorry, briefly if you can, Christy.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things is that we expected people have enough of a desire to get back to normal so that they would accept the vaccine. Now
The economy as well, yeah.
Yeah, now we've seen that it's not the case. It's not enough.
Yes.
So yeah, I think the mood at the moment is pretty depressed, but in a way it hasn't prompted people to become more oriented towards vaccines.
All right. Thank you, Christy. And of course, thank you, Ms. Yambo, for joining us. Any final words from the Ministry of Health? I'm sure you want us to get vaccinated.
Now, getting vaccinated is the right thing to do.
Yes,
Get vaccinated, get to the nearest clinic, and get your dose.
All right. This is still the Afrobarometer survey, and we're just talking about COVID-19 vaccination hesitancy. After the break, we'll be looking at lived poverty in Namibia. Stay with us. Welcome back to the launch of the Afrobarometer survey. I've been joined by Christy Kilder, who is the MD, correct? Managing Director. Did I get that right, sir?
Yes.
Yes, it is, of Survey Warehouse, and we're talking about their findings. Right now, we'll be talking about lived poverty with Ms. Renani Musutwa. I hope I got that right.
You got it right.
And
I'm pleased to be here.
It's good to have you here. You're, of course, from the Basic Income Grant Coalition. Could you please briefly just introduce yourself to our audience?
Yes, as you said, I'm Renani Musutwa. I represent the Economic and Social Justice Trust, as well as the Basic Income Grant Coalition of Namibia, because we are part of the coalition.
All right.
Yes.
So let's get into the statistics. It's lived poverty. I don't expect there'll be many smiles, but let's get into the facts. Christy.
Yeah. let's just quickly say what lived poverty is. We measure poverty as the frequency with which ordinary people have to go without one or more of 5 specific basic necessities. That includes cash income, water, cooking fuel, medical services, and food. So it's almost like a consumption-based or a quality of life-based definition of poverty, which is very different from the kind of definitions that the World Bank or the government would use in terms of poverty datum lines and so forth.
All right, thank you for that. All right, let's get straight into our first slide.
Yes, I think we start off with a picture on unemployment, which of course of late has always been or has been a big point of discussion. And here we have data dating back to 2003. So the second time we did the Afrobarometer survey. And we can look at and see that normally the unemployment amongst the 18 to 25-year-olds is the highest compared to the rest of the population or the population at large. Until 2001, so between 2019 and 2021, and I suspect we're dealing with the direct impact of COVID, the second youth cohort, which is the 26 to 35-year-olds, are actually now, unemployment is higher among them than it is amongst the 18 to 25-year-olds. And we suspect that maybe because of COVID and people losing jobs, that it's people in this kind of category, age category, that has lost their jobs. So right now we see that youth unemployment, we measure at 43%, 18 to 25, and then 45% amongst 25 to 35-year-olds, and only 37% for the population at large. So the youth is making up the bulk of the unemployment at the moment.
Yeah, the millennials, so to speak. And you know, the issue with millennials and economy has been one which has been, the economy changed a lot for millennials. I'd say twice, you know, essentially at some point millennials couldn't buy houses anymore, and then COVID-19 comes through and somehow they're the first ones out of the door. What do you make of these findings?
Yes, I mean, it's for sure that COVID has had a huge impact on the employment rates in Namibia. But we have to keep in mind that all these years, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank has always been advising our government to make sure that it reduces inequality and poverty, and also make sure that there's more work created, because it's a threat to our economic development prospect. So I'm not really surprised by the statistics. I mean, we've always, as a coalition, we've always been trying to make the government aware of what the current issues are, and that something should be done to help people out during these difficult times.
So do you think it's not an issue of information, it's an issue of proactiveness?
No, I think the key problem that we see at the moment is that where you can almost excuse some degree of unemployment amongst the 18 to 25-year-olds, we are now seeing the country's tax base being eroded by the high level of unemployment amongst the 25 to 35-year-olds, which actually are the beginning of people's productive economic lives. You know, this is the time when people start spending money in the economy, they start earning, they pay their taxes, they may be able to increase their consumption. So if that's not happening, and I think the UN has recently released a result that says Namibian young people will remain financially dependent on their parents until the age of 27, right? So that group not being employed has to be kept alive. And the question is, how will we do that? Or who would do that? It puts a tremendous amount of pressure on households that are already struggling, as well as the government.
Yes, it's a dependency issue. Shall we get straight into your next slide?
Yes. So here are the 5 components of lived poverty. And the percentage that you see is the percentage of Namibians who had to do without any one of those 5 at least once during 2021. So you can see 79% of Namibians said that they did not have enough cash income at least once during 2021. And then the second category, of course, is food. 64% said they did go without enough food at least once during 2021. The same with medical services, 58%, water 51%, and cooking fuel 49%. And I think this is how the impact of how we measure poverty. We can tell almost immediately how people experience poverty, right? Which is very difficult if you only have a number and said people below this number are poor. What does it mean? And here we see what it means. And we can see that there's this direct link between unemployment and income, cash income, and then food and food security. 80% of Namibians buy their food. That's their source of food insecurity. So the very minute we lose access to cash, we become food insecure.
Indeed, and not to mention prices currently going up.
Yes.
Rinani, what are your observations?
Yes, those are the exact observations that we've been making, that we've also seen. That's the kind of trend that we've seen before and, during and now at this stage where we are. That a lot of people are really struggling to survive. It's a real struggle out there. People don't have money, people don't have food, so they depend mainly on family members. It's very usual that you get one person of a household of 10 members who works, and that person is like responsible for providing all the family members with food and little financial support that they would need. So it's a burden on those, who are working. That's why I think it's a good thing that Christy asked what should be done. There are many things that can be done. Obviously, there are long-term economic strategic changes to be made, but on a short term, we would always recommend the basic income grant.
Basic income, yeah. I was going to say, I'm pretty sure you're going to champion that.
Yeah, because that at least will take away that food insecurity that people are experiencing now, whereby they would have to go to rubbish bins and dumps to look for food, and go to memorial services to make sure they get something to eat, or visit people they know and don't leave before they get served anything to eat. So people are really struggling. It's really, really common that people are struggling, and it causes a lot of financial stress and malnutrition. And malnutrition is something that is, the #1 cause of death among children under the age of 5 in Namibia. Something drastically needs to be done to make sure.
And of course, not to mention what it means for personal dignity.
Exactly, and that's why the Namibian suicide rate is double that of the global rate. It's because of the financial stress that people are going through. And talking about gender-based violence, which is caused by all these insecurities that people are going through on a daily basis, because they don't know if they're going to be alive tomorrow or dead today. So that puts them in an awkward situation whereby they don't really care much about the future, what's going to happen tomorrow.
So it's more or less just a cycle, a recurring cycle. Christy, please take us into your next slide.
Yes, so we've selected to take us through or focus on 2 specific dimensions of lift poverty, and then look at the time dimensions of those. As I said, the first time we've run the lift poverty index was in 2003. And you can look, for example, that since 2008, we have 2 categories. Those who had gone without this basic necessity, in this case cash, at least once. So that's what we call sort of low lift poverty, right? High lift poverty are those who go without these things almost, always, or many times. And you can see that, for example, in 2014, only 21% of Namibians had high lift poverty based on cash income, right? That has now gone up to 42%.
It's double.
Right? It's doubled since 2014. And you can see that the number of people who've had low lift poverty, so any form of lift poverty, has also increased from 65% in 2014 to 79% in terms of access to cash, which is a really, really important point as we've been making. So longitudinally, the problem has gotten worse.
Yes. So Rinani would naturally suggest basic income grant. Do you think that would be effective?
Well, I think that combined with employment creation. We've also got a question in the Afrobarometer that asks about the so-called people's agenda. What are the biggest problems government should solve? And ever since we first asked that question, it's always been unemployment.
Renani?
Yes, unemployment creation is a long-term, structural changes that obviously needs to be done. But we need some short-term intervention, immediate intervention, because this is a crisis.
Yes, if we're looking at doubling the numbers in 6 years, yes.
Exactly. So poverty, malnutrition, all those things have become a crisis, and we need to intervene right now. We can't wait for 5 years. God knows how long it takes to, to make the economic structural changes to make sure that people have employment. So it's been scientifically validated that the basic income grant is by far the most efficient way through which we can reduce malnutrition and poverty, so people can live decently.
Okay, and decent and dignified lives. You have another slide for us, Christy?
Yes, the last one. Here we're looking at the component of food over time. And again, those two categories, those that have gone without at least once, you can see in 2003 it was 43%. It has now gone up to, is that 64%? And those that have gone without it always or many times have gone from 11% in 2003 to 24% in 2021. So again, the food insecurity has gotten worse, and you can see, especially since 2014, again, when it was people with high lived poverty, was only 6%, it's gone up to 24%, so it's increased 4 times.
I can't help but wonder, is this a systemic issue? Because when you have fluctuating graphs and fluctuating numbers, it would make me feel like certain things aren't being addressed. If we go up a year and it goes low and goes up, it makes me feel like there's nothing that gives us stability. Is this a systemic issue?
Well, it's systemic in the sense that you could see things were going at one rate up until a certain point, and then it changed. In 2014 has been a watershed year for much of Namibians in terms of their lived poverty. And I think, something like this also draws attention to the fact that we import 60% of the food that we require locally, which makes it highly susceptible to price fluctuations, and it's very expensive. So I think in terms of the basic income grant, with it needs to be a policy or a strategy or a drive to get Namibians to grow more food. Even in urban areas. There's been exciting technological changes over time. We don't always need a lot of land. In fact, in some kinds of modern ways of growing food, you don't really need land. You can grow them agroponically. And we don't need a lot of water because we don't often have those resources. So we keep on blaming, and we need to get away from agricultural techniques that are heavily reliant on rainfall or land, because the land is getting more and more infertile. And we know, we had a drought for 6 years prior to this one. So, yeah.
Renani, final brief words, basic income grant.
Basic income grant is definitely affordable. The government thinks that they cannot afford it, but it is affordable, and it shouldn't be discriminatory, because what the government is planning to do now is very discriminatory in the sense that they're only going to give it to about 42 to 45,000 Namibians. And when we look at those stats, there needs to be more people included. Otherwise, it's not basic income grant. You can just as well say that you've
exclusive income grant, so to speak.
Exactly. It shouldn't be exclusive. It should make sure that it targets at least a lot of people.
All right. Thank you very much. This was Renani Musutwa, who was our panelist from the Basic Income Grant Coalition. And of course, Christy is still here sharing the statistics and of course explaining their findings. This is the launch of the Afrobarometer survey. After the break, we'll be talking about gender-based violence with Ethni Maj. Thank you for staying with us as we look at the Afrobarometer survey, round 9, if I'm not wrong, Christy.
Yes,
round
absolutely,
9.
round
We've been
9.
at this for a while.
Yes, since 1999.
Since 1999. Now, if you dial back 10 years before that, that would be 1989. Am I wrong? That's correct, right? And
Yeah.
in 1989, Sister Namibia was, of course, established, and it's good to have you here at Nimaj. And I understand you also do some work with Alchemia. Could you briefly just talk to the audience about your work before we talk about the gender-based violence statistics?
Thanks, Ashwin. You've got such a good memory there. Yeah, at Sister Namibia since 1989, as you said, we've been working as a feminist magazine to really amplify the voices of those people who are usually silenced, to really put pressure on duty bearers to enact change. So we are involved with movement building there. And then at Alchemia, we're involved with designing and facilitating change processes. So we work with the likes of the World Bank and BRAC International. And our curricula is currently running in, I think, more than 30 countries in the world.
Wow,
So, yeah,
wow, that's
fantastic.
incredible. Now, before enacting change, you need information. And Christy has got a whole lot of information for us. Shall we get into your slides?
Yes, please. The first slide sort of tells us something about the value system that I think underpins a lot of gender-based violence. And that is whether it's ever justified for a man to use physical force to discipline his wife or his partner. And you can see 58% says it's never justified. 28% finds sometimes a justification for it. And 13% says it's always justified. So if we add those two together, we're close to 4 in 10 Namibians who still believe that physical violence as a form of disciplining somebody, your partner, if you're not happy with something that they've done. And I think that's a shocker.
Ethne, what have you seen in Namibian communities with regards to this in particular?
Yeah, I mean, the first time I saw the statistic, I was quite encouraged. I was like, oh, okay, that's the majority of Namibians who think it's never justified. Look back a bit, and in 2017, 84% of Namibians thought it was never justified. So that's not too many years ago. In that time, we've also seen a decline of a few other things. We've seen that women have less access to the internet. Women have less decision-making power when it comes to their finances and their families. Unemployment has risen in that time. And this all while we're patting ourselves on the back for 50-50 representation. So I really think it's cause to be very wary of, token ideas that we're doing well when actually things are getting worse.
Things are getting worse. I remember looking at some research by the World Health Organization, and COVID-19 made things exponentially worse, especially because a lot of people were isolated. They could not leave home, etc. Anything on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, worldwide, we saw levels of GBV rising as a result of COVID-19 and so many exacerbating factors that we can imagine at that time. And at the time when we were talking about this to Namibian leaders, we were having those shut it all down protests. And the general consensus was Namibia is immune to this somehow. And I wonder how. What makes Namibia immune to increases in GBV when the whole world is coming under, increased levels of unemployment, staying at home with your captor or your abuser, all these things that we know make it worse.
Yeah, indeed. Christy, any word on that before we get into our
Yeah,
next
I
slide?
just think, I have to make it clear that this is a sub-module within Afrobarometer. So it's not a study that focuses exclusively on gender-based violence. There are other forms of violence that we haven't probed for, the economic dimensions of it or the financial dimensions of it. So this is really just the tip of the iceberg.
Yes, I can imagine. Shall we get into the slide?
Yes. We wanted to know, and there are all kinds of issues with asking people directly if they are victims of gender-based violence. There's lots of ethical protocols which we can't follow in a survey of this nature. So we use a technique whereby we would ask people to reflect on their community. So the question here is, in your area or in your community, how common do you think is it this phenomenon of gender-based violence? And you can see 29% said it's very common, and another 28% said it's somewhat common. So only about 40% said that it's either not very common or not common at all, which means in almost 60% of cases, people think it's common.
It's common. And for the people who think it's not common, are they choosing not to see?
I don't think so, actually. I think this really clearly shows us that we are very aware of the fact that we all live in a violent society. Like you said, it's almost 60% of us are comfortable saying that it is at least somewhat common. The definition of the question can be quite narrow because not all of us share the same definition. And as you said, our scope is narrow because we don't have enough money to really do this to the full extent that we want to. But how narrow is everyone's definition of violence in that question? You know, I wonder how many people would include marital rape as violence, or would include corporal punishment of minors as violence, or would include financial and economic coercion as violence.
Yeah,
and we're seeing this a lot. The pitfall of assuming that everyone has the same definition of violence is that we ask questions that don't get to the root of the problem. So, example, I think of a 2014 Afrobarometer question that asked, in the last year, have you or anyone in your family been a victim to GBV? And the truth is, we don't often think of ourselves as victims of GBV or of our family as places of GBV, even when in fact our family has instances of GBV. We don't think of ourselves that way. So if you ask the question in terms of behavior, you can often avoid the pitfall of assuming the same definition. And it's not always as easy as I'm going to make it sound. But if you were to say something like, in the last 5 years, so you're making the time frame a bit wider, did you or anyone you know experience being threatened by something that could hurt you? So now I'm not confused about the definition of violence, but I can think of a specific behavior, and then we might get even more people saying, yes, I know of violence in my community. But despite that, despite the narrow definition of what this question might elicit, it's a big number. Almost 60% of us know that we're living in a very violent society.
Christy, shall we get into the next slide?
Yes. The next slide is about whether members of communities think that there's a risk for women who report gender-based violence, which of course may have an impact on people's willingness to report. 32% says it's very unlikely, 24% said it's somewhat unlikely, and then we get to those who says it's somewhat likely, 24%, and very likely, 18%. Now, by itself, 18% is almost 1 in every 5. Add to that 24%, and we again have a significant number of people who believe there are consequences when women take gender-based violence cases. I can just add that one of the other questions we asked is whether they think the police would take it seriously. And yes, that is definitely Namibians believe the police will take it seriously. Whether there's help available, the majority think there is help available in communities, should people look for it. Of course, one need to understand exactly where what form that help would take, or exactly how that is distributed across the countries, because there will be places with more and with less. But at least it's not all negative. People think there is a kind of a safety net, so that when people or women would sort of report these cases, even if they may face consequences, that at least the police will take them seriously.
Yeah, and of course, that comes down to perception, and certain communities feel safer around police, others do not feel safer around police. And I can imagine as you're asking these questions, there's this thing where people say, don't snitch, which is essentially what you see, don't talk about it. Did you get a sense of people saying, of course, we do have this section, you have the bar, which is saying people, wouldn't want to comment, but do you feel like that could have also made them lean towards giving you a favorable answer?
I think maybe it's very difficult to gauge exactly what underpins these values. But what we know is, for example, that when we ask about the justification, that first question, we found that women have the same kind of opinions as men almost, right? Which suggests it's not a male-based value system. It's something that runs throughout. And we also see that it doesn't really matter, what your income level is. There's a good section, about 18% of men or people with high levels of income or no lived poverty that feel, that it's justified. And the same we see when we ask questions about is it justified to use physical force to discipline your children, the same amount of people feel the same way. So I think there's a value system that underpins violence of all sorts in our society.
It is a cultural issue. Ethne, your thoughts on those findings?
Yeah, I mean, when I saw this, I was actually a bit shocked that people had the amount of faith that they do in authorities to protect them. Because I know that many stories of people going in to report violence and really being laughed at for their bruises not being serious enough, and police officers calling their neighbors in to join in on the joke.
And also people being turned back. Is this something that you really want to do?
Absolutely. So many people being turned back that we know that there are so many women who report cases of GBV and then withdraw it, that it's frustrated the Ministry of Gender so much that Honourable Sioka said, we need to start arresting victims. So when that level of authority in our society is saying, let's arrest victims, it's surprising to me that we have people feeling that, they're going to be treated fairly. No, in fact, we're being threatened with arrest. And I really think there are two possible reasons for this type of discrepancy. And the one is that we have a high level of deference for authority in this country. So, whether it's church leaders, traditional leaders, or police, when someone walks into your home with a uniform, it's really difficult to say to that person in this culture of deference for authority, no, I don't trust people like you with authority to have my best interest at heart. You need to be very brave to do that.
Yes.
So that could be one thing that could be, skewing this. And then another thing is actually misattribution of causes. So, from 2017 to 2019, while we were having like 200 cases of GBV per month, we also had about 71% of people saying that they thought government was doing a really good job when it came to GBV. But I wonder how many of those people would actually be able to name one thing that the government was doing. So why do we see this discrepancy? And I think often people say, GBVs as a result of unemployment, or it's because of alcohol abuse. But actually, when we correctly attribute the cause of GBV, we have...
Sorry, Ethne.
Yeah.
Could you hold on to that?
Yeah.
It just will allow that to be your last word. Christy,
Okay.
you do have some slides for us, right?
A last one, which I think connects with what she was
All right,
trying to say.
okay, lovely. Let's get into it. Let's have a look at Christy's slide.
The next slide is about whether people think gender-based violence is a criminal matter or whether it's a private matter that has to be attended to by the family. And the majority of people here, over 70%, says that it is a criminal matter and that it needs the involvement of law enforcement. Which I think is also something that may be a reflection of that, it is a criminal offense to beat somebody up. But then again, the question is whether police has got capacity or, at least it tests people's knowledge that it is not a private matter. It's actually a criminal offense.
All right. Ethne, some final words as briefly as possible.
Fantastic. Yeah, I'll add it on to my last little bit. When we correctly attribute the cause of GBV, we can see change happening quite quickly. So in Uganda, we had a case where cultural leaders were enacted to help equalize power dynamics between men and women. And in a question of 3 years, women were half as likely to be physically assaulted by their partners. So this statistic is so encouraging that people are seeing it as a public offense and not a private offense. Maybe with that type of attitude, we can put pressure on duty bearers to enact the type of change that we need.
And collective responsibility as well.
Exactly.
All right, we're just talking to Ethne Mudge from Sister Namibia and Alchemia. I'm still with Kirsty Kuldar, and after the break, we'll be getting some of your questions if you do have any. If not, we'll of course be able to wrap this up. And what we have been talking about is the Afrobarometer survey. This is the 9th round. You've been at it for a while. I know I keep saying it, but it does say that you guys are focused on something and you're focused on changing the trajectory of Namibian communities. See you after the break. You have been watching the 9th round of the launch of the Afrobarometer survey as we find out the experiences and how people and the attitudes of Namibian communities towards COVID-19 vaccine hesitancy, lived poverty and gender-based violence. Renani Musutwa has rejoined us. We're going to get into a couple of the questions that you, our viewers, have posted. Now, here's the question. Is it not more important than ever for government to be open to and act on survey results like these? It seems our leaders more often dismiss opinions and perceptions as unfounded criticism. Where do you
Yes.
Please.
That's something that we've seen quite a lot in our political arena, that government officials don't really want to hear all these bad things about what needs to be fixed and all that, because they are in denial that we've got issues that we need to deal with in this country. And
are they in denial or are they ignoring? Just
Well,
what's your opinion?
yes, I call it politics of poverty. That sometimes they feel that if you empower people, then they will stand up and rise and revolt. So I would say that it's intentional sometimes that we are being kept in an enforced state of poverty, just to make sure that we don't have enough time to hold them accountable, because people will be busy struggling to survive. So there would be no energy and time left.
All right. Christy, your thoughts?
Well, we've been doing this since 1999, so I'm quite comfortable with politicians getting ruffled up with some of these results. It's changed a lot over the years. In the beginning, it was a lot worse. I think, the people often experience this, or politicians experience this as some form of personal attack, which it's not. It's just giving ordinary people a voice and a channel to say, listen, this is what we think, this is what we experience. So it should be a valuable source of information to say, but rather than us having to go on a tour across the country, here's a way of finding out what people think and what we need to prioritize.
All right, let's get into the next question. It seems a lot of people are still not truly acknowledging the true extent of GBV, when up to a third or more do not think it is a problem in their society. I know Ethne touched on this a little bit. Christy?
Yeah, I think, again, we provide a rough and ready measure of it. It's most certainly an underestimation, and also because it excludes some of these other dimensions of the problem that we spoke about. But it's a start, and hopefully we could generate more momentum with surveys like this.
All right. Renani, final words. I know you are leaning on basic income grants,
Yes.
understandably so.
Absolutely. I mean, when we just spoke about gender-based violence, and some of it has to do with the fact that women are so much, financially and materially
Not economically
dependent,
empowered as well.
yeah,
Yes.
dependent on men, and I think that causes a lot of violence as well. So if we at least give people, enough people, at least 1.2 million Namibians, basic income grant, that will really reduce women's dependence on men, and hopefully, reduce violence in that way as well.
All right. Christy, could you give us a short overview on your findings and something else you may have looked at as the survey warehouse?
Yes, well, the Afrobarometer started with much more of a focus on democracy, governance, and issues around the economy. So those issues, the core issues of Afrobarometer, we've been tracking since 1999. And maybe I can just give you a few highlights around those.
As briefly as possible. We are out of time. Yes.
The key issue is Namibians seem to have lost faith in democracy being the best system to run their country. And satisfaction with democracy has sharply declined. It is now at the lowest level it's ever been. And I think it connects to democracy's ability to deliver economic goods, the sort of things that we've just spoken about, especially poverty, income and unemployment.
All right. Thank you very much. We were
Ashwin.
joined. Yes.
Sorry, just a
Renani.
quick one. The government thinks it's really expensive to give people basic income grant, but they have to remember that basic income grant is an economic stimulus policy as well, because there will be more money circulating in the economy, and that way it increases work and employment.
Okay. All right. So, Christy, you've seen our guests. You heard the opinions. Do you see anything that you could incorporate into Afrobarometer?
Yes, and I also think what excites me is the possibility of putting the data in the hands of people
We'll
who
leave
need
it
it.
there. I love that. The possibility of putting the data in the hands of people who need it. We have run out of time, but this has been the 9th round of the Afrobarometer survey, and we were joined by Mr. Chrissy Kulder, who's the Managing Director for the Survey Warehouse, Rinani Musutua, who's from the Basic Income Grant Coalition, Ethni Maj from Sister Namibia and Alchemia, and of course, Ms. Emma Iyambo from the Ministry of Health and Social Services. Have these statistics restored your faith, or do you feel, like I said earlier, so little done, so much to do? My name is Ashwin Berry. Thank you for joining us.